This episode of Crosscut Talks is supported by Alaska Airlines.
Hey, welcome to Crosscut Talks. I'm Mark Baumgarten, the managing editor at Crosscut, and today we're talking about a revelation and how new knowledge about the past can change the conversation and maybe the course of a country. The revelation here, though, is something that was hidden in plain sight. All Americans, more or less, understand that slavery is a part of the American story. But until a few years ago, slavery's fixed place in the American imagination had rarely been expanded on or challenged, in the popular consciousness anyway. There was very little public conversation about how exactly it came to be, and how the legacy of such a brutal, oppressive institution shaped the next 400 years of American life, up to this very day. That all changed with the publication of the 1619 Project, a massive work of journalism created by today's guest, Nikole Hannah-Jones. Launched by the New York Times in 2019, the project puts Black Americans at the center of the American story, starting with the arrival of the White Lion, a ship that carried captive Africans to the shores of what would become the United States in 1619, a year before the Mayflower. The project has become a major text for the racial reckoning that has unfolded in the years since, and it's been met with severe resistance from some quarters. And it's not done. Hannah-Jones published a book version of the project last fall and is currently at work on a documentary series based on the project, all of which she explores in this conversation with University of Washington professor Christopher Sebastian Parker, which took place in early May in front of a live audience at Town Hall Seattle as part of the 2022 Crosscut Festival. I want to add here that this is a serious conversation, but it's also, at times, a really fun conversation. You can sense Hannah-Jones feeding off the crowd. There's a lot of goodwill in the room. And it's worth noting that this is the first time in 3 years that we've had a crowd for a festival session. And it's really something special to hear people in the room responding to Hannah-Jones's insights. This conversation, and all other conversations on the keynote track at the 2022 Crosscut Festival, is sponsored by BECU, which would like to share the following message. BECU believes that every forward thinker deserves added momentum, so for over 85 years they have offered financial services and support to the community. Members have access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs through the co-op network, and online resources. BECU is a member-owned credit union that puts people over profit. Learn more at becu.org. Federally insured by NCUA. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Oh, and one other note, this talk does contain some profanity. If you have any feedback, please send it to talks@crosscut.com. Okay, on with the show.
Nikole Hannah-Jones, welcome to the Crosscut Festival.
Thank you.
All right, so now that we are officially on CP time, we had a little discussion about that backstage. It wasn't us, we were on time. So I'd like to start with a recent exchange you had with Chris Wallace on the subject of democracy. And basically, you made a claim with which I completely agree, that absent Black folks, we wouldn't have a democracy. Can you elaborate on that, please?
Okay, that's going to be a whole lecture. So
Please,
we're only going to get one
please.
question. Honored to be on stage with you. Thank you, everyone, for coming out. I know there's not much else to do in Seattle anyway, so just playing. Just kidding. I mean, we're going to start out spicy, so let's just...
Hey, wait a minute, Nikole. This ain't Portland, right? This is not Portland.
That's not dissing me. I got the hell out of Portland. So anyway, it is good to be back in the Pacific Northwest to visit. It is the most beautiful part of the country. It's the most beautiful place I ever lived, and I'm always grateful that people want to come and hear me talk about the legacy of slavery and anti-blackness. So happy to be here. And so yes, as you know from your own work, the argument in the opening essay for the 1619 Project, the essay is called Democracy, and for people who have studied this history, it's not a radical essay at all. Because we know that we were not a democracy at our founding. In fact, our founders didn't intend for us to be a democracy. And certainly, while we have these grand visions of who we were at that moment of our founding, the lofty ideals of the Declaration, we hold these truths to be self-evident, all men are created equal, endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights. The man who wrote those words owned 200 human beings at the time that he wrote those words. The man who wrote those words brought his enslaved brother-in-law, who was the half-black son of his wife, with him to keep him comfortable as he was writing these words of liberty. And we have been taught that it is incidental that so many of our founders engaged in human trafficking. We have been taught that it's incidental that the man who wrote the Declaration's occupation was to enslave people. That was his job. That's what he did for a living. That's how he made his money. The father of the Constitution, enslaver. Drafter of the Bill of Rights, enslaver. First president, enslaver. 10 of our first 12 presidents, enslavers. And yet, we have been led to believe that that was incidental to the country we would become, and that we were somehow a democracy even though women couldn't vote, white men who were poor couldn't vote, black people certainly couldn't vote. We weren't even considered part of the body politic, and indigenous people were also not considered part of the United States. And so the beauty of it is, though, that even though black people were not included in those words of the Declaration, black folks who either could read or who heard about the Declaration said, oh, this is a liberty document. You can't argue that all men are created equal and enslave us. And black people saw those words and have fought generation after generation to make those words manifest. We have been, as I argue, based on the work of everyone from Du Bois going forward, that black Americans have been the primary democratizing force in this country. And how can you argue factually otherwise? You can't. Because all of our great expansions of democracy have come on the back of black resistance and black freedom struggles. And initially when I planned to make that argument in the book, or in the original project initially, I was thinking about the period of the civil rights movement, and of course how we don't have a democracy until 1965 with the passage of the Voting Rights Act. But then I realized you have to go back way earlier than that. You have to really go back to the beginning. There's a great book by Woody Holton that just came out a few months ago, where he argues that it was a black person who turned the Declaration into a liberty document. That if you know your history, which we're Americans, so you probably don't, but if you know your history, the Declaration is a succession document, right? The Declaration of Independence is laying out, it's a columnist, the white columnist, laying out all of the reasons they think that they should break off from the British Empire, that these are all of the crimes, these are all of our grievances. It wasn't a liberty document. We think about it that way. We think about that opening stanza. But the whole rest of the document is just them listing all of the things that they think the Crown has done, including riling up enslaved people to lead insurrections against their enslavers, and including not allowing them to steal more indigenous land. So these are all in our Declaration of Independence. But a black man read those words and said, I don't care about all the rest of that. Those opening stanza are incompatible with slavery, that you can't make those arguments. And again, black people fought in every single war that this country has ever waged. I opened that essay with my father, a veteran like you who flew the American flag in the front yard. And as a black girl, I didn't understand how a black man born into apartheid Mississippi would fly the flag in the front yard.
That's right.
And came to realize that what my father was laying claim to was a type of patriotism that we don't like to acknowledge in this country. Black people have to be the greatest patriots that our country has ever produced, because how do you fight on behalf of a country that has never treated you as citizens? How do you believe in founding ideals that didn't include you? And how do you not only fight for your own rights, but for the expansion of rights for all marginalized people in this country? And so that's the argument that I was making to Chris Wallace, which he was okay with that argument. What he wasn't okay with, of course, was imagining that all of these great men of the greatest generation, the World War II generation that we like to think of as helping to save democracy in the rest of the world, were violently suppressing democracy at home for Black Americans. And Black Americans were going abroad and fighting to liberate others, and then coming home and being lynched for wearing their uniform. And this is how we have to think about America, is with all of that hypocrisy, complexity, that nuance, and holding in our head, you know, he said, yes, our government was racist.
That's what he said.
But those individuals couldn't have been racist. Except the people are the government, right? And the man who lynched Emmett Till was a World War II veteran. The man who shot Medgar Evers, assassinated Medgar Evers, World War II veteran, right? And we have to be able to hold both of these truths, or all of these truths, in our head at the same time. But what I'm really trying to argue, I know, see, I told you it's going to be the whole lecture, is how would we think differently about Black Americans if, instead of always engaging us as a problem that needs to be resolved, as problematic people, right, who need to be fixed, if you center us as actually the perfecters of our democracy, the people who actually have believed in our country's highest ideals, so much so that we join the service at the highest rates of all racial groups. So you think every time you hear a statistic about Black disproportionality, out of wedlock births, poverty, crime, you hear all these stats about how we're disproportionately represented, but you never hear how we're disproportionately represented in those who are willing to lay down their lives and die for their country. You never hear that.
A woman after my own heart. Okay. Unbelievable. That was great. And
that's what most men say. So. I came to have a good time. We can talk about, we can talk about heavy subjects and have a good time, right?
We got to start it in the green room, y'all. We got to start it in the green room.
I shouldn't have had that second glass of wine.
But just briefly to circle back, for Black people, democracy has often been aspirational, right? So if you think about this book that was written in 1944, Gunnar Myrdal's An American Dilemma, and I remember reading this a long time ago, and it was often the Black people who had so much faith in America, Black Southerners, right? And I could not understand that for the life of me. But again, as Nikole said, you know, democracy for us has generally been aspirational. And there's always these people going around saying, "Ooh, America's the longest democracy." No, it's not. No, it's not. As Nikole said, 1965. Period. You guys need to burn that into your brain, right? We are not the longest continuous democracy.
Fact.
Period.
He just had to get that out.
No, it just makes me mad when I talk to these political scientists. Oh, no, we're not. Right? Okay, sorry. All right. So now we get to the crux of the issue here. What motivated the 1619 Project?
So I'm going to give two answers. The petty answer is that the 1619 Project is the answer to every time a Black person has been told slavery was a long time ago, why don't you get over it? So, and it was the answer one, let's just be clear, nobody wants to get over slavery more than black people, right? Like, it does not benefit us. And we would wish not to live under the yoke of the anti-blackness, the inequality being at the bottom of every single indicator of well-being. That all comes because we are descendants of American slavery and had the audacity to survive the end of slavery, right? So this project seeks to answer that question by saying, you can't get over an institution that is foundational to the very country that we live in, that almost nothing, right? The English landed Jamestown in 1607. It only takes 12 years before they begin engaging in African slavery. So there's almost nothing older in the original 13 colonies than African slavery. 250 years we had African slavery. We've had 150 years without slavery, which means we had slavery longer than we didn't. Slavery was foundational to almost every institution that would come out of the original 13 colonies. And so obviously it shapes our society in all of these ways. And so if you haven't read the book, people often talk about it as a history. It's not a history. It is a work of journalism that is talking about our society today, that says, look at democracy, look at capitalism, look at why you're stuck in traffic because our very highway systems were created to segregate black people from white people. The American diet, healthcare, that all these areas of our lives are being shaped by the legacy of slavery and the anti-blackness that rose up to justify slavery, even when we don't acknowledge it, that this foundational institution is shaping our society, it is ordering our lives, our most vexing tensions, are, all the ways that we're exceptional in ways that we shouldn't be proud. We're the most carceral nation in the world. In the world. We are the most unequal society in the history of the world. We have great wealth and the highest rates of poverty of any of the Western industrialized nations that we like to compare ourselves to. We're the only one of the Western democracies where whether you can go to the doctor or not depends on if your job offers you health care. No universal child care. The only one of these societies where a woman has to go back to work in 6 weeks after she has a baby because she doesn't get any income. All of these things can be traced back to slavery. And so it's shaping our society, but we're not acknowledging the way that it's shaping our society. So that is why I wanted to produce this project. I came across the date 1619 when I was 16 years old in high school. I grew up in Iowa, a very cosmopolitan, diverse state. And I was bused into white school starting in the second grade. So there weren't a lot of black folks, but there was still enough to segregate us. And my school district entered into a voluntary desegregation program to avoid being sued by the Department of Justice. And so we were bused into white schools, and my high school offered a one-semester Black Studies course. And in that one semester, I learned more about the history and contributions of Black Americans than I had learned my entire life. And 16 is already that period of radicalization where you're starting to challenge, where you're starting to be skeptical. And I was angry because I just thought, you mean all this time we had all this history that could be taught? Black people had contributed things not just in the United States, but across the globe. And I realized that information had been withheld intentionally, that people knew this, but hadn't taught it to us. And so I became obsessed with learning the history, and I would ask Mr. Dial, who was the only black male teacher I ever had, who taught that class, to give me books to read, and he put Before the Mayflower into my hands. And it changed my life. Because about 30 pages in is when he talked about the White Lion in 1619, which is the name of the ship that brought those first enslaved Africans to Point Comfort in Virginia. And then I realized what the cover of the book was talking about. I thought Before the Mayflower was talking about Africa, but Before the Mayflower was talking about an American history. And we all learned the story of the Mayflower and the Pilgrims in 1620. But the White Lion, which was much more important to the American story, I would argue, than the Mayflower, right? It introduces slavery. Slavery is the thing that almost destroyed our nation, was completely erased from the story. So this project was about forcing a reckoning with who we really are as a country, or attempting to, and trying to stamp the year 1619 into the national lexicon to force us to grapple. 1619, the anniversary was the 400th anniversary of American slavery. There's nothing in America that's 400 years old, but slavery is.
Wow. Okay, yeah. I actually had another question I was going to ask you about. What were the 1619 Project's goals, and have they been achieved or realized? I think you kind of your response sort of bled into that a little bit, but can you elaborate? So if you were to think about so one of which is, of course, to have the year 1619
Yes.
indelibly stamped on the American psyche, right? So that I think the audience would be with me. I think you achieved that.
Yeah.
So are there any other goals?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that was, I remember when I pitched the project, and my editor asked me what was the goal, and that was the goal. And it seemed ridiculously aspirational at the time, that you could produce a work of journalism that could actually force a date and a moment into the national psyche. And to even believe you could do that also would take a lot of hubris, right? So I was like, this is what my dream would be, but I didn't expect that we could actually accomplish that. And to be clear, clearly I didn't invent 1619. And Dr. King talked about 1619. Du Bois talked about 1619. He says, right, before the Pilgrims came, we were here. Langston Hughes, the opening poem in the book, the epigraph, is a poem about 1619. So Black folks, scholars, activists have been talking about 1619 for a long time, but it didn't seem to permeate, right, the kind of national and collective memory of who we are as a country. So I definitely wanted to do that. And then I have a much larger goal, which is not yet fulfilled, but if you read the very last essay in the book, it's very clear. The very last essay in the book is called Justice. And the larger goal is to finally help propel us to reckon with what we've done, and then to acknowledge that a great debt is owed to the descendants of American slavery, and we repay that debt with reparations.
So if you permit me, I want to follow up on that. Do you think if the orange orangutan had not been in office when you published the 1619 Project?
I don't know who you're talking about. Who you talking about?
Number 45, right? I won't say his name, right? Number 45. Would it have resonated as much, do you think? I mean, just speculate on that.
No.
Okay.
No, I thought a lot about that. And when the project came out, of course, Republicans accused me of creating the project just to harm Trump, as if I somehow forced the first Africans to be sold in 1619. The 400th anniversary fell when the 400th anniversary fell. It just so happened to fall under the president who was a white nationalist who followed up on the first black president. But I do think there would have been a different response because, as you know, as we were discussing backstage, for many white Americans, Obama was a gift because they wanted to believe that we had ushered in post-racialism, right? That a black man ascending to the White House meant that we had resolved the race issue. And we don't want to hear about that anymore. Whether I voted for him or not, he's there, which shows America is not racist anymore. And this was happening, not just conservatives, but lots of progressives, people in the news media. So many of us journalists were trying to push back and say, no, Obama going to the White House didn't change anything on the ground for black people. The symbolism mattered for sure, but Trayvon Martin was killed under the Obama administration, right? Police were still killing black folks. Black folks were still the highest poverty rates. Everything that existed before Obama was still existing in black America, but now we were being told, what are you complaining about? So I think had you tried, had to publish the project under the Obama administration, if the anniversary had fallen then, folks would not want to be talking about slavery. They wouldn't want to be talking about the legacy of slavery because we have gotten beyond that. But of course, what happens in America is what always happens. There's racial progress and then there's racist progress. And we get Obama and then we get a white nationalist. And suddenly all these folks who thought Obama had ushered in a new era of post-racialism were having to question, well, how does the same country do these two things back to back? And so they were looking for answers, and the 1619 project gets published in that moment.
Okay, thank you. What would you say to having spoken with you, spent some time chopping it up with you backstage, I know what you would say, right? But I'm just going to ask this question anyway for them. What would you say to those who say that your work has only deepened the polarization in an already polarized country? Go fly a kite, like something like that?
So it's always fascinating to me how people take silence as being peace, right? So somehow, if this project didn't exist, we wouldn't be polarized. That if Black people don't talk about the truth about our country, if we can continue to live in the fiction of a country whose history we've learned that doesn't actually exist, right? The history we've learned about America, that country does not exist. It has never existed. And that's not polarizing, right? The lies, the omission, the manipulation of nationalism, that's not polarizing. But speaking the truth is. So, of course, you know what I would say to that. It's bullshit and it's tired.
Right.
Because, to quote Dr. King, like the real Dr. King, not the I have a dream, one line that everybody trots out once a year, Dr. King. But he talks about the negative piece. And that's what they want. They want a negative piece that is predicated on us being silent about our conditions, us telling lies about who we are as a country. I'm a journalist. That's not what I got into this to do. And if you actually believe that we are a great country can withstand the truth. A great country doesn't have to lie about itself in order to exist. Du Bois says it best. He says nations do great and nations do terrible things. And we have to own all of that. And I don't get the idea that if we are suffering in silence, that is how we unite. We are not a united country. We have never been. And even when we talk about this idea of democracy, what we were was an ethnocracy, right? We were a democracy for white Americans. And this idea that we had less polarization in our politics, as you know, I always hate when I start talking to somebody's area of expertise. He's a political science. But they were predicated on exclusion. So yes, we had less polarized politics in the 1950s. I wonder why. Right? When you can exclude Black people from voting, when you can exclude brown people from voting, when you can disempower women, when you don't have to deal with all these people whose politics are different than yours and whose perceptions about America and their wants are different from yours, and it's only white men ruling, then yes, you might not be as polarized. But that's a negative piece because you only get that veneer of tranquility by the violent suppression of us. And you want us to just remain hidden and invisible in our suffering. And I refuse to do that.
That's right. That's right.
We'll be back after these messages.
Dreaming of a long-awaited vacation? Take your travels to the next level with Alaska Airlines. They're committed to providing a higher standard of safety and cleanliness throughout your journey. From mask requirements and touch-free options to HEPA filters on board and fresh air every 2 to 3 minutes. Plus, their award-winning loyalty program, Mileage Plan, makes it easy to earn and redeem miles wherever you go, including destinations worldwide, thanks to their One World Alliance membership. If you're ready to land a low fare, next-level care, and the best experience in the air, book now at alaskaair.com.
When you think about institutions that are like a Langston Hughes Performing Arts Institute, the building, when you think about the Northwest African American Museum, when you think about the James and Janie Washington, when you talk about a Black Arts West and how they play into the community, it is the places that have helped community come together when no one else could, right? Those are places that have allowed for marginalized groups to come together and tear down the walls of not being your authentic self.
Being a storyteller, Sharon Williams was able to capture what I'm trying to do with season 1 of the Black Arts Legacies podcast beautifully, so I had to let her tell it. I'm Brooklyn Jamerson Flowers, and this is season 1 of the Black Arts Legacies podcast, a show from Crosscut exploring the history and ongoing impact of Black art and artists in Seattle. I just moved to Seattle, but in talking with Black artists, several spaces came up time and time again as critical to the legacy of Black arts here. So that's what this season is about. The Langston Hughes Performing Arts Institute, the James and Janie Washington Foundation, the Northwest African American Museum, and Black Arts West. Through conversations with artists and other people heavily involved in these institutions, we'll discuss how they were built, their value to the lives of artists, and what the future holds for each. You'll find a new episode every Wednesday in June, so hit that subscribe button wherever you listen and get hype. I know I am.
So, as many of you know who have read the 1619 Project or followed the aftermath, there has been like a really, to borrow a term from my colleague here, violent reaction to the publication of the 1619 Project. And so we spoke about this briefly backstage, about sort of like, so I guess my question is like, what if anything about the ensuing backlash wasn't anticipated?
Much of it. So I'm not naive. I knew that there would be backlash, of course. I knew that there would be critique, as there should be. You don't produce something this ambitious in the New York Times and not expect critique. And I've never produced a single work of journalism that I thought was perfect and that I thought was above critique. So I expected that. And then, of course, you don't argue in the New York Times that we were founded as a slaveocracy and not a democracy, that our founders were grave hypocrites who didn't actually believe in the words they wrote, but Black people did, and we're the perfecters of the democracy, and we're the true founding fathers of this nation. You don't do all of that and not expect there's going to be some pushback, right? So I knew that, and frankly, had there not been pushback, the project would have failed, because we weren't trying to tell a comforting narrative of America. We were centering the people who have been forced to the margins. We are centering the people who have been treated as the bottom and saying, actually, these are the truest Americans, because you wrote the words and had the power to implement them and chose not to. We had no power, and yet fought, right, to democratize this entire country and died generation after generation to do so. So I knew there would be pushback for that. Again, even though, like anyone who has studied the field, it's not radical. It's based on 6 decades of scholarship, much of it done by Black scholars, but not all of it. It's not radical. So what I didn't expect, though, was the intensity and the duration. I certainly didn't think the President of the United States would come after the project. I didn't think that 2 of the most powerful senators in the country, Senators Tom Cotton and Senator Mitch McConnell, who both descend from enslavers, but I'm sure it has nothing to do with it, that they would have a bill in Congress seeking to strip federal funds from any school district that teaches the 1619 Project. They say that the project will destroy the very foundation of America. Now, I am a badass journalist, but I'm not that bad. I believe in the power of journalism, but if a single work of journalism can destroy the very foundation of the country, that country's not that strong in the first place. But to be very serious, I became a target of the right. Fox News, other right-wing media, threats to burn down my mother's house, a severe targeting for the work, because when Donald Trump and his sons and members of his administration go after your work in that way, and these are people who stoke violence, then people threaten you with that violence. And right now, there are 38 states that have either passed laws against the 1619 Project, prohibiting it from being taught, or against what they're calling critical race theory, but we know is just anti-history and anti-blackness. 38 states, it's more than half of the states that are passing or considering those laws. It needs to be said, healthy societies do not ban books, and they don't ban ideas, they don't pass laws. So, I could not have predicted that, right? That the project would be legislated against. It is illegal by law to teach the 1619 Project in public schools in Texas. It is illegal to teach the 1619 Project in public schools in Georgia. It is prohibited by the State Department of Ed to teach the 1619 Project in public schools in Florida. These are three of our most populous states. I could not have imagined that a work of journalism would be that fearsome that it would be legislated against. But I'll also say, outside of the Pulitzer, it's probably my greatest honor.
So can you comment briefly on, there was what happened with the fallout from the progressive historians,
Yes.
5 that we discussed, and then there was another one who was a fact checker, who happened to be a black woman at Northwestern. And so can you talk a little bit about like how you responded to that? Because I'm kind of sure, I'm thinking that you kind of expected something like that from the Sean Valences of the world and stuff like that, right? But from this black woman, I mean, so how did you process that, for lack of a better term?
So first I want to deal with the 5. If you don't know the story, 5 historians that many consider to be progressive historians circulated a letter. Well, first they tried to get other historians to sign on to it, disputing certain facts in the project, disputing the overall framing of the project, claiming that there were factual errors in the project. And when they couldn't get other historians to sign on to it, we actually published the letter in full at the New York Times, really detracting from the project. And the key things were, we were wrong about slavery and the American Revolution. We accused Lincoln of being racist.
Oh. Who wanted to send us back to Africa? That's right.
That's not racist, though. That was for our best interest. Which we actually don't. I don't accuse in the essay Lincoln of being racist, but I do say he didn't believe in black equality, so you take that how you want. Anyway, so I wasn't expecting, I expected critique. I knew that there would be historians. One, we do different type of work, right? What historians do and what a journalist do is not the same thing. Historian will never write an essay spanning 400 years. They don't make big sweeping claims, right? They do work that is very incremental, that's very tight, the rhetoric, they don't use rhetoric, they try not to. So we weren't doing the same thing, and I knew that there were always going to be some historians who were like, I think that argument was too strong, I wouldn't have connected these two things, and that is fine, because that's what historians do all the time, right? Historians publish something, and then other historians will publish an article critiquing what was published, all within the realm of what I expected and what should happen. But these historians didn't do that, right? They didn't contact me and say, I think there's an error here, you should correct it. They tried to secretly discredit the project. They tried to circulate a letter, whom other historians leaked to us, right? In order to discredit the project. So we have to separate real critique and why would you respond in that way? To this day, none of those historians have ever reached out to me. Wow. They went to my bosses, and they went to, frankly, white men at the New York Times who didn't even work on the project.
Right.
But not to me.
Right.
And this is the thing I think is important in the Pacific Northwest, which is you can be progressive on everything but race.
Boom. Boom.
Okay? So they are progressive. They are progressive, but historians are like journalists, and are like anybody in this room. They're human beings. And we want to think of the field of historiography as a science, but it's not. And there are many progressive white historians who are just invested in the idea of American exceptionalism. Right. If you look at this is going to get way too granular for most of y'all, but if you look at the field of early American history, it is not diverse. Because black scholars who wanted to focus on slavery, who wanted to focus on the hypocrisy of our founding, couldn't rise up in the ranks. They were stopped by the gatekeepers who also want to protect this idea that we are a fundamentally good nation founded on great ideals and principles.
That's right.
And downplay what slavery meant. So that was what that critique was about. Now, I have owned up that I wish in my language about the period of the American Revolution, I had been more precise with my language, that by not being as precise as I should have been, I opened the door for the type of critique that allow people to try to discredit the project. And in the book, I've read 10 books just on the American Revolution. That section is now expanded to be twice as long. And all of the history works that is based upon are cited, and actually all it did was allow me to strengthen my argument. So our argument's actually more powerful than it was before, and I know more than it was before. But then there was the black historian that you're talking about. And I won't lie, that one was actually sort of devastating because she published an article in Politico. I didn't know that she was a fact checker on the project. She never told me that she had an issue, and instead she published a piece that has been the most used piece against the project because people want to discredit the project when they can say a black woman said, you did this, right? Then it gave them a certain power of authority over the work of the project. And I just wish, this is what I'll say. Anybody who's ever published anything in here, I would dare anyone to put their work under the type of scrutiny that the 1619 Project has been under and see does it come away unscathed.
That's right. That's right.
When we published the book, I've never been so calm at publication in my life, right? Because usually when you publish, for me, it's a 3-week span of time where I don't want to check my email or answer my phone because I'm waiting for someone to tell you got something wrong, right? That's devastating. As a journalist, like, all we have is our credibility. And once, so you don't, normally it's not a celebration when I publish, it's a type of deep anxiety where I'm worried that I got some fact wrong. But when the book published, I'm like, there's literally nothing else y'all could say that hasn't been said. This has been so scrutinized, and we had to be so careful that I was perfectly calm upon publication. And so I guess I say all that to say, this project was deeply personal to me. I cared a lot. I gained like 20 pounds working on this project. When people say, what was your self-care? I was like, drinking and eating. Which I've learned is not actually self-care. But it meant, like, it's the most important work of my life, and I wanted, this work is a love song to our people, and it meant so much. So to have people not in good faith try to critique it, but in bad faith to try to discredit it, there were like devastating moments, and that Leslie Harris piece was one of those devastating moments. Okay. It really was. Okay. So thanks for asking me that question.
Yeah, no worries. Because I'm like, hey, you know what? No, don't boo me. Stop, right? I'm like, wait a second.
I told him he could ask it.
I told him he could I looked her up and I'm like, whoa, this is a black woman. Oh, wait a second, this ain't cool, right?
But I will also say, though, in her defense, so the headline is Politico. The headline was shit, because that's, it's political. Politico, the publication.
Yeah.
But the article was, like historians write, very nuanced, The article critiques the 5 historians for ignoring slavery, right? For downplaying slavery. And it says, you know, I wish Nikole would have been more careful here, or I didn't agree with her interpretation there. But as y'all also know, nobody reads the articles. They read the headline, and that's all that they needed to know. And so I think that she felt she was doing something that was normative to the field, which is you publish, I publish a critique. None of us could have known how politicized this project would become and how politicized her critique would become. So I don't think her intent was not to discredit the project. She thought she was helping.
Okay, thank you. So this is the last substantive question.
Okay.
I got the little card over there, so so what's next? What's next on your agenda?
Yeah, so the 1619 project is just taken over my whole life, which I could not have imagined when I pitched the project, what the project would become. So right now we are filming the 1619 documentary. Yeah. And if you listen to the podcast, which most young people think 1619 is a podcast and not a written project. The documentary is a 6-part series, and it's going to air on ABC and Hulu, and I'm very excited about that. So I'm spending most of my time these days working on the documentary.
All right, yeah, unbelievable. Okay, so here my script says, it says Chris, and so I follow with, well, unfortunately, Nikole, looks like we've run out of time. Thank you for joining us at the Crosscut Festival this year. It's been a pleasure, and thanks to all of you who joined us tonight. So let's give Nikole a hand.
And that's it for today's episode. I'd like to thank Nikole for the talk, as well as Christopher, who, for the record, is a board member for Crosscut parent company Cascade Public Media. If you enjoyed this conversation and would like to attend another one like it, go to crosscut.com/events. That's where you'll find all of our upcoming events. This episode of Crosscut Talks was produced by Sarah Bernard and engineered by Rusty Bacall and Victoria Ralph. The event was produced by Jake Newman and Andrea O'Meara, and Ann Krisnovich managed our audience engagement. You can subscribe to Crosscut Talks wherever you listen, and if you like the show, please review us. It helps other people find us. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. And if you would like to support the work that we do at Crosscut, whether it's the live events we host every month or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/membership. In addition to supporting our journalism, members receive complete access to the on-demand programming of Seattle's PBS station, KCTS 9. Crosscut Talks is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Mark Baumgarten. We'll be back soon with another conversation.